Good morning, ladies and gentlemen, and I'd just like to thank Aguas de Portugal for inviting me here today. It's really a great honor for me to be here, and thank you, Nuno, for the kind invitation. I'd like to share with you today some of the work that we're doing about IWA and some of the priorities that we're looking at in terms of the international water sector. And I think what really sort of epitomizes what you're seeing in terms of the water sector is this recognition that the way in which we designed our systems was really based around 19th century principles. It was when we thought water was abundant, it was when we thought populations were relatively small, and it was when we thought that the environment was relatively benign. And so we designed these systems which are very water intensive. We move water long distances, we create one quality of water for everything. We tend to use that water once. And then if we're lucky, we may treat that water before disposing it. And this type of approach, which we've adopted mainly in the West, we've tried to promote in the emerging economies. And frankly, it's unaffordable for most of the world. And so they're trying to now rethink how they do water. And I think many of us would agree that if we were designing our systems from scratch, we might not have designed them the way that we currently have them. The biggest challenge that you see, and where you see a lot of the focus moving forward, particularly for the next sort of 20 to 30 years, is in the area of wastewater and sanitation. It's still very, very neglected around the world. And it's not only in sub-Saharan Africa and South Asia, but large parts of Central Europe and Central Asia, South America. We generate huge amounts of water, but we're not very good at managing the water once it's used. And of course, that creates huge challenges to the environment. And where we have intervened, where we have gone and built wastewater systems, this is a diagram of wastewater systems, wastewater treatment works in Ghana. It was a study that was done in my last organization. We haven't engineered them particularly well. So we've been very quick to build this infrastructure, but if I click the slide now, you will see how many of the systems are actually working, okay? So this is how many systems were built, and this is how many systems were working. So the engineering of these systems have not really been appropriate for the context in which they are. And so we have a challenge now, but also an opportunity to rethink how we design some of these wastewater systems. I think if you look at what's happened in the West, the last sort of 40 to 50 years was like a big pilot study. We designed very large, clunky systems, concrete-based systems, and we were sort of constantly iterating and optimizing and improving and improving. And we are now slowly starting to converge on systems which are much smaller footprint, systems which are more energy efficient, and systems that have much lower both CapEx costs and OpEx costs. And so you can see some of the innovations that have taken place in things like thermal hydrolysis, which reduces the viscosity of the sludge and improves the energy production of, and the sludge handling facilities in anaerobic digestion. Things like granular sludge, which allows you to have much smaller footprints in your oxidation processes. These types of innovations are now starting to become mainstream. And I think in many of the emerging economies, we have this opportunity now to create much more sustainable, much more efficient and effective wastewater treatment systems, and systems that can really contribute to the whole circular economy concept. So what we see in the water sector are changes in perspective, okay? And I think the biggest change that you're seeing is the way in which we view water. We're starting to ask ourselves, what is it that we want the water to do for us? And we are then trying to match the quantity and the quality of the water for that particular use. In the past, we just created one quality of water and we used it for everything, whereas now we're starting to try and see how we can match different grades of water for different types of uses. And what this does is it moves us away, when we have increasing water demand, it moves us away from building large capital intensive projects to move water long distances. And we're starting now to invest in efficiencies within the system so that we can use water multiple times. And you see many examples of these sort of productive, these different grades of water. The first diagram on your left would be, it's from the West Basin Initiative in California, in Los Angeles, where they create what they call designer waters. They use different plug-and-play technologies, membrane-based technologies, to create different grades of water for different uses. And this is wastewater that's being retreated. And you can see a lot of research going on things like indirect forward osmosis, where they're using wastewater to dilute seawater in a forward osmosis way. So it treats the wastewater, but at the same time, it dilutes the seawater. So when you go into reverse osmosis, the energy requirements are reduced. So there's a lot of innovation in the whole space of trying to create these different grades of water for different uses. But what's critical, and this is really the big change that's required, and it's still not being there, is that we view the entire water cycle through a single lens. And we look at all water that flows within that water cycle as good water. It's just water of different grades. And so, for example, if I had an increase in demand for drinking water, the question could be, do I extract more surface water to meet that demand? Or should I invest in, say, leakage management or demand management to free up high-quality drinking water? If I wanted to water my plants or flush my toilets, then can I extract more surface water from afar and bring it? Or could I invest in some treatment of my grey water and black water for those purposes? So what it allows you to do is it allows you to view all these water flows as good water, and it allows you to try and match the different grades for different uses. And critical to this is modeling. And you see quite a lot of work now going on in integrated urban water models, where we really try and sort of create a circular type process, where we try and match these different grades to different uses. And what we're seeing is we're starting to model packets of water as they move through the system. And we're creating digital signatures for those packets of water. And those packets of water have in them sort of an estimation of how that water was generated, what are the grades of that water. And by using both water flow and contaminant flux models, you can start to match these different grades of water for different uses. So you reduce your overall water footprint. This is some work that I did some time ago in Uganda, where we were asked by the World Bank to look at how to meet the growing demand for water. And in Kenya, sorry. And the solution of the decision makers was the very obvious one, to say we should extract more surface water. So SW1 is surface water 1, surface water 2. And so their natural solution was to go further, to bring more water to the city. And the length of these boxes is the quantity that's available, and the height is the unit cost of that water. Now, when you start applying these integrated urban water models, you actually see that there is a lot of water embedded within the system that could meet the majority of that growing demand. So you don't actually have to invest in capital-intensive projects to bring water forward. And you can bring down the unit cost of water by doing this type of water balancing. Of course, when you start looking at more exotic uses of water, like, say, black water, it starts to increase the costs. So these solutions are really based on modeling, and it's not a religion. It's really where you're using these types of integrated models to understand where do you get the biggest return on your investment to meet that growing demand. But it moves you away from this notion that you should only invest in capital-intensive projects. And the other big area that you see quite a lot of innovation, and I'm sure all of you are very familiar with this, is the way in which we view wastes. In the old days, we used to see, a house discharging a lot of shit, if you like, and we think about it as a burden, as a big problem. Now we start seeing it as a resource, and we say, wow, there's a lot of calorific value in that waste stream. There's a lot of nutrients in that waste stream. And of course, there's a lot of water in that waste stream. So how can we harness that? How can we capture it? And again, having a sort of integrated perspective of your water cycle allows you to think, where is the best place for me to capture energy? Is it in the drinking water system through microturbines, or is it in the wastewater flows, again with turbines, with heat recovery, and then at the wastewater treatment works itself through things like biogas production, microbial fuel cells, etc. And similarly with nutrient recovery, you can do it on site, looking at fecal sludge and how you might generate nutrients, or you can do it more at the centralized wastewater treatment works. The challenge here is really to try and understand what the business models are that are going to allow you to generate value from these waste streams. Many of us imagine that if we have an understanding of the volume of the nutrients we can generate or the amount of energy that we can generate, that's fine and that's where the discussion stops. We very rarely think about the market for those products. And in my last organization, we did a lot of research where we really tried to understand who are the customers for my products. So if I'm generating energy, is it myself to sort of sustain my own wastewater treatment works, or am I planning to sell that energy to the grid? If it's nutrients, am I selling it directly to farmers, or am I selling it to fertilizer producers? And so first, you have to understand who are your customers for these products that you're generating, and then you have to ask yourself, why would they buy the product from you and not from somebody else? What is your value proposition? Okay, and do you have some competitive edge in the market? And then you have to really understand the channels for you to move that value proposition to those customer segments. And what is the infrastructure that's needed in order to do that, right? What is the cost of building that infrastructure to move that value proposition to the customers? And what is the potential revenue? And I'm sad to say that currently, when you look in detail at a lot of these resource recovery solutions, they are not currently at the level where they provide, financial sustainability. It's still very much in the research and development stage. This is an example of the struvite production that most of you are aware of, and this is where you precipitate phosphorus from your returned activated sludge lines. And for a long time, it was argued that the profits were being made from the production of the fertilizer, the crystals that were being produced. But actually, the business model was much, much more sophisticated. Most of the money being generated in this business model was in the reduction in maintenance of the wastewater treatment systems, because the phosphorus precipitates in the returned activated sludge lines and it blocks the pipes. And that creates a huge sort of maintenance cost. And so what these companies were able to do was to, by phosphorus stripping, they were able to reduce those blockages, and that's where the bulk of the income was being generated. And also they were reducing the nutrient discharges, and so there was some money being generated there. And the cherry on the cake was really the sale of the fertilizer. So it's much more complicated than just thinking that it's the fertilizer that makes the money, right? There are many areas in which the money is being generated, and it's quite complicated to understand what these business models are. But we need, as a sector, to understand those business models so that we can invest in the right way. Now, this move from productive use and resource recovery and reuse, this new thinking that you're seeing emerging within the water sector, is changing the language of the water sector. And we're now moving away from this notion of a water treatment system or a wastewater treatment system. And we're now starting to talk about water machines or water factories, where we have waters coming in of different grades. And we turn the handle and we generate waters of different grades. We turn the handle and we generate energy from these machines. We turn the handle and we recover nutrients from these machines. And what you're slowly starting to see is where people are deciding to locate these treatment units or these machines is very much based on other criteria. So for example, it may be that energy becomes the priority. And water is really just a feedstock in order for the wastewater, or the used water is just a feedstock in order for them to produce that energy. So where they locate it strategically is where they may be able to maximize the co-digestion of both food waste and agro-industrial waste, food waste, and the wastewater, so they can maximize the energy, because that's becoming their priority. And similarly, they might look at nutrient recovery as their priority. So you're seeing a shift in the way we think of water and wastewater treatment, where we're looking at the byproducts as the primary purpose of installing some of this capacity. And you see examples. This is an example of some colleagues of mine from TU Darmstadt who sort of built a water machine in Qingdao in China. It's been running for about 4 or 5 years, but it's a small scale. And that comes to my next point, is that when you look at trying to do all these clever things with water and used water, this circular economy approach, size starts to matter. Water is quite heavy, And you don't want to move water long distances and then move it back because you lose some of the potential gains that you might get. And so people are starting to recognize that smaller, decentralized systems, systems that serve populations of around 30 to 50,000 people, are much more adaptable or much more effective in doing some of this resource recovery and reuse. And in emerging economies, people see an advantage that if you build these small units, then what you can do is that as the city starts to grow, you can start adding modules. So this whole decentralized approach has an adaptive capacity that you don't have with large centralized infrastructure. With large centralized infrastructure, you have to anticipate growth and you build backbones. Whereas with these decentralized approaches, you can follow the trajectory of urban growth much more carefully. And so you're not investing in large infrastructure that might actually become over-designed. So that's the other area that you see a lot of interest in, the whole area of decentralization. Now, what I've talked about is really how the water sector is getting smarter, right? We're becoming smarter in the way we're designing our systems. We're starting to design them in a more adaptive way. We're using more advanced technology. We're getting smarter in the way we use water and the way in which we reuse water, and this whole area of resource recovery and reuse. And the next area I want to talk about is really digital water, the area of smart control. And this is where we're starting to think about, deploying digital innovation, but it's really important to understand that this digital innovation is an enabler. It's allowing us to do these clever things that we want to do with water. It's not the end itself. It's a facilitator, an enabler, that's going to allow us to sort of close this, to do circular economy and this type of thing. Now, when you look at digital innovation, what you see is that most of the innovation that's on the horizon is related to data, right? And it's related to, if you like, the way in which you capture data and the way in which we process data. And with data, you have the 3 or 4 V's, the velocity, so we're now collecting data more frequently. We're collecting more variety of data, that's the second V. We're collecting both structured and unstructured data. And that means that we're generating much more volume of information. And so therefore we're shifting the way in which we're starting to analyze that data and the types of models we're using in the analysis of that data. And then we're connecting that with sophisticated systems to act on that data. So within IWA, we have a digital program, and we're really looking at an ecosystem. And as I said, we start off looking at the sensors. So sensors are becoming smaller, they're becoming cheaper. And as I said, in terms of the beads, they're being able to measure things more frequently, so the velocity of measurement is increasing. The variety of things they're measuring is increasing. Stratifying has recently created a 16 multi-parameter sensor for wastewater, and the veracity, the accuracy of that data is improving. So there's a lot of work on the development of sensor technologies. Now that information that we're collecting gets fed into sophisticated data processing tools. And what you're seeing in the sector is a shift from mechanistic models, these sort of physics-based models that we were traditionally used to much more sort of data-driven models, or a hybrid of mechanistic and data-driven models. And it's that combination that's changing the way we're doing it, because we're now starting to depend on much more sort of self-learning, pattern recognition type systems. And because we're combining structured data, the numbers that we collect, with unstructured information, this is more sort of linguistic images and these types of things, we're able to also deploy models which sort of do things like natural language processing. And we're starting to move into the space of cognitive computing, where we're able to weigh, context and conflicts and almost respond like maybe a human might have responded. And that information is then being fed into smart devices, smart pumps and valves that have sort of onboard mini computers with IP addresses, where they can take this information and they can self-regulate, and they can start communicating with themselves and sort of adjust. And so you're seeing the ecosystem resulting in what you might call a sort of a silent running system, a system where human intervention is minimized, and that these systems are sort of self-regulating and managing themselves. And that's where you see the change in the skill sets required by the water sector moving forward. These are some of the potential applications. I'm sure most of you are aware of these applications in the water sector for the sort of digital innovation. But what I'd like to share with you is some examples. So when you look at an area that's really problematic, right, and it's an area that I did a lot of work in, which was sort of pipe condition assessment, where it's quite a dark art. You're seeing now that people are combining, they're having much more information of the pipes themselves, so they're almost monitoring how the pipe is aging in real time. And they're combining that with unstructured data around the quality of contractors, because pipes break more frequently if the contractor quality, the people who were laying those pipes were not as good as they were in the past. Service history notes, these are more the unstructured data. And they're combining this internal data with external data in terms of traffic conditions, weather conditions, soil moisture deficits, shrinkage of the soils, etc. And the volume of data that's being created is then being fed into these sort of data-driven engines, these data mining engines. And we're combining that, as I said, with mechanistic models. So we might combine that with a hydraulic model that tells us how significant different pipes are in terms of their carrying capacity within the network. And by combining both the pipe condition and the significance of pipes, we can identify which pipes are our priority pipes to act upon. And as we do that, we can then develop optimized or rehabilitation programs, and those programs can then provide a feedback loop to those data mining engines. So the rules are themselves dynamic within the model. Similarly, when you look at sort of things like leakage reduction, again, a lot more sensors in the pipe, so when there's a pipe burst, immediately the pressures and flows can be monitored, the changes, and you can do inverse modeling to identify where the burst has taken place. And then you can enact an optimal valve isolation program that allows you to isolate, to identify which valves have to be isolated within the network, so that you can minimize the losses within the network very quickly. And then by combining your integrated asset management system with your customer information system, you can immediately inform your customers in a very proactive way that there's going to be an interruption. And you can also inform your repair teams, your crews, on the exact location, the type of pipe that burst, so that they are taking out the right materials on time to repair and replace those pipes. So again, by integrating these different databases, you're able to sort of combine both your business processes, your customer information system, and your asset management system, so that you can get a much more holistic response to that. And then when you look at things like smart appliances in the house, what they're able to do now is to negotiate directly with the utility when they might purchase water, when the cost of production of that water is lower, which then reduces the overall peak flows that take place within the distribution system. And using things like blockchain, they can engage with sort of smart contracts. And in real time, they can choose when they purchase water and when they utilize that water, so that the utility benefits from reduced peak flows and their overall energy cost of producing that water. And so you see this type of innovation. I've only focused on networks here, but there's a lot of this stuff going on now within the water sector. And when you take it to the macro level, you're starting to see communities coming off the grid in certain parts of the world. You're seeing housing developments of, say, 10,000 people, and then because they're doing circular economy, the closed-loop sort of systems, they are requiring less water off the grid, maybe 40% less than they might have. And again, because they have localized storage, with smart contracts, they can start to decide when they purchase water from the distribution network. And again, it's in the interest of the utility, but also for these off-site developments to purchase water when it's at the lowest cost for both. So these smart contracts can sort of kick in, and you're seeing some of this happen. But this recognition that the city sits within, the urban water cycle sits within a city, and that there are these different resource flows, encourages us to sort of have a much more holistic view of a systems approach to the way in which we manage resources within a city. And you see a growth in urban metabolism models and this whole smart city concept, which is really trying to capture data from these different sectors and trying to leverage that combined data information to get the best return on investment. Similarly, when you look at the watershed, so the city is a system of a system. It sits not only within the city resource flows, but it also sits within the watershed. And the urban water professionals are trying to optimize their system. You've got the ag sector trying to optimize their system. And then you've got industry using a lot of water and looking at how they might optimize. And of course, we need water for nature. But again, there are lots of interactions between these different sectors. And By using digital and using data from these different sectors, we can start to understand how best we can optimize and how we can get sort of like a systems optimization taking place. So there's really a need for us to understand that with water, we are dealing with a system of systems of systems. The next question is really in IWA, we've been looking at different utilities and asking where are they on their digital maturity journey, okay? And we've identified these different sort of positions in that digital maturity journey. And when you look at the basic level or the opportunistic level of digital maturity, this is where you are really focusing on individual units within your water cycle, so your clarifier or your distribution network for leakage reduction. And it's very silo-based, it's single components, and you're using very simple rule-based systems. So you're saying if something exceeds this value, then you should take this action. It's a very reactive approach, okay? And this is where most utilities are in terms of their digital journey. And when you look at the way in which those utilities are also dealing with their customers, it's also very reactive. So they inform customers after something has happened, or it's when a customer calls them that they then respond, okay? So these are utilities that are in that sort of basic and opportunistic stage of digital maturity. As you move to the more systematic and differentiating stage, what you see is that a utility has a much more integrated view of its entire water operation, as I said before. It's combining both structured data and unstructured data. So it's combining sort of customer complaints, sort of phone calls that they have with customers with numerical calculations and things, and even social media where, you know, people are complaining about the smell of water or the taste of the water. And they're also combining sort of external data sources. And they're using sort of more self-learning algorithms, okay? So the rules are not static, but they're dynamic. As they learn from their intervention, they modify the rules within their models. And what they're able to do is to predict in advance, say 3 months in advance, they know that a certain pipe is likely to fail, and they can take measures to minimize the implications of those types of failures. So it's very proactive. And the way in which they deal with their customers is also much more proactive. So they're informing their customers well in advance of challenges that they might face. They're advising their customers on the best course of action to take in terms of water conservation, reducing their bills, etc. So it's a much more proactive approach. And you see things like, you know, gaming algorithms that are being used to change the behavior of customers, so they understand how people are using water within their community, and they can sort of, you know, gamification, so they can sort of try to reach certain levels of achievement in terms of water consumption, and they can see what the impacts of that are likely to be. Now, when you move to the real sort of transformational side, it's quite interesting because this is where people start to value data, right, much more. And a lot of what I've talked about is the internal monetization of data. It's using data to improve your operations internally, right? So you save money. But if you look at the telecoms industry, they have collected data and used that data and generated income externally by selling that data to people who can learn a lot from that data. And this is where you see you know, a lot of opportunities from the water sector. And for the water sector to capture some of that value, they have to sort of start to unbundle the data that they collect. So there's a lot of data that we collect at the consumer household level, which really tells us a lot about the consumers, their behavior, their attitudes. And then we have a lot of data on the infrastructure itself, and that has a lot of value for certain types of individuals. And so unbundling it and understanding the potential monetization may be the way in which we're able to sustain our digital journey. So you see, for example, there's work going on in terms of the development of smart toilets, where analysis of the stools and the urine take place, and that information is being captured, and that information is then being provided to health providers. And you know, the way in which people's stomach works and things is quite complicated, and for doctors, having regular understanding of people's sort of patterns of going to the toilet and the types of, the characteristics of some of the waste that they generate is very baseful, it's very useful. And you see work going on in this space. And the water sector, of course, is harnessing huge amounts of data And so this is an area that, you know, we are not really moving in that direction, but I think that we have to be aware that others might enter into this and really exploit this. And there are some real challenges associated with this in terms of who owns the data, right? Privacy issues. And we shouldn't ignore the fact that organizations like Google and Microsoft, they see huge opportunities of capturing a lot of data from consumers, and that the water sector is where a lot of this information is being generated. And then, of course, you know, in terms of our networks, we're monitoring so many things. We start to understand how the pipe materials are behaving over time, which type of conditions affect pipes, and we can start providing, you know, pipe manufacturers, rehabilitation technologists, etc., either analytics as a service or data as a service. We can analyze the information and sell it on, or we can actually provide them with the raw data that improves the performance of those industries. So you see a lot of thinking taking place in this space. I'll finish now by just saying that, you know, one of the problems that we have in the water sector is that we're very slow at taking up new ideas. This is this is the CAMBI process, right? Where, and you can see the paper, the original paper, and I think the CEO mentioned early on about academics and utilities working close together. The initial paper for the CAMBI process was published in 1978. And it took nearly 30 years, right, for pilots to be built using that technology. And the tipping point was really 35 years after the initial discoveries were made. And so the sector is fairly conservative, and it's very slow at diffusing these new ideas. And we have to be quicker. We have to accelerate the diffusion of innovation. And one thing I just want to leave you with is that there's a view that the water sector are really elephants, right? That we are very conservative and we're very slow at moving, etc. And this is some work that was done by a colleague of mine from DC Water, Vairavamoorthy. And what you know, the analogy that we find is that there is a correlation between the gestation period and the lifespan of different technologies, right? So if you take a long time to research something and develop it, it usually ends up lasting a very long time. And we tend to think of the water sector, it's characterized by these large concrete infrastructure, these pipes in the ground. And these are really the elephants within the infrastructure that we have, right? They have long gestation periods, and they tend to last for 50 to 100 years. But the water sector is not, you know, it's not homogeneous in that way, right? There are also what you might call horses, which have shorter gestation periods, and they have shorter lifespans. And these are the machines that sort of affect the physics of our processes, the stirrers, the pumps and valves. And these have a much quicker innovation cycle, right? And then, of course, you have the hairs, and these are the digital, the smart controls, the monitoring systems, and they have very, very short gestation periods and very, very short lifespans. And what tends to happen in the water sector is that everything gets controlled by the elephants. Right, we buy the elephants, and they sell us the machines, and they sell us the IT. And they tell us the IT will last for 50 years or 30 years, and we believe them. And what we need to do is to sort of forget this sort of the verticalization and sort of think about it in a more horizontal way, and understand that the procurement cycles and the types of people we employ who manage the hairs within our systems, and the types of people and the procurement cycles we employ to manage the horses should be different from those people that are managing the elephants within us. And we need different types of individuals managing these different parts of our water cycle. And what you'll find moving forward is that it's the hares and the horses that's going to allow us to repurpose our elephants. Right? If you look at something like the CAMBI, thermal hydrolysis, right? You're changing the viscosity of your sludge, and that allows you to load your anaerobic digesters more aggressively, and if you use good stirrers and good pumps, it allows you to load them in a more effective way. And then with good controls, the stoichiometric control, you can avoid digester upsets and this type of thing. So you can really repurpose a concrete anaerobic digester plant by using more advanced hares and horses. So you don't think that you're always locked in by the elephants within your system. I always finish with this slide, right? This is always my last slide. I think that we are not in a position to stay in the business as usual lane. You know, with global change pressures taking place, climate change, population growth, our assets are deteriorating, the cost of energy is going up. There are lots of challenges. And the reality is that we're going to have to do more with less. Where we are currently is that we're trying to optimize relatively bad systems. We have highly centralized systems, and we're trying to optimize them. We're trying to do as much good as we can with our elephants, right? And that's the middle lane. But I think really the future, particularly in the emerging economies, is a paradigm shift. It's a shift to more decentralized systems. It's a shift to systems that, at the design stage itself, they are designed for nutrient and energy recovery. Okay, they're designed at the design stage itself to generate waters of different grades. And that really then takes us to a paradigm shift in terms of the way we manage water. And digital is going to enable us to do some of those clever things. And we mustn't think of digital as the end. It's really helping us to do some of those clever things that we already know we have to do in terms of the water sector. So that concludes my presentation. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Professor Kalla. Agora é tempo para algumas perguntas e respostas ao professor. Se alguém tiver alguma questão.
Hello.
So my name is Pia Jacobsen from Denmark. I'm here for 3 weeks. It's very interesting to hear your presentation. So I'd like to know, when you challenge us with all these perspectives, do you see a sector becoming less risk adverse in the future than we have been before? We still need to be in compliance and a lot of uptime in our system. So how do you see that work when it gets more and more decentralized and operated by smart systems?
Yeah, I think that's a very good question. And I think there are two things, right, that I found in my observations talking to utilities, and we had some good conversations yesterday evening about this. The water utilities have to be risk averse, right? They're dealing with public health. And, you know, that is a non-negotiable sort of objective that they have to meet. There's no question about it. But I think also there is a culture, a conservative culture. They're monopolies, they're large organizations, and they don't institutionalize within their organizations sort of innovation itself. They don't create mechanisms to find new ideas and to encourage the deployment of some of those new ideas through pilots and through demonstration projects. And so I think there are two different things there, you know. The culture we find in many of the utilities is that, you know, they're quite complacent, right? And I think that what's really interesting that you see in other sectors is you're seeing the growth of open innovation, right? Where you're getting people who are willing to give up some of their patents that they've had because others might be able to do something with it rather than protecting it. You're seeing situations where someone in Portugal does the research, the pilot is done somewhere in Germany, and then the full-scale demonstration is done somewhere in China. And if we can create that type of innovation environment, right, and create the culture within the utilities, I think that things will change. Yesterday we had a conversation and I was saying that you find a lot of the innovation is taking place outside the sector, right? And there's a danger that the sector gets disrupted without itself even knowing because of the culture. And so it has to be open and much more proactive in embracing some of this change. Any more questions? Yeah, please. Excuse
me. Thank you for your presentation. I noted here that the key questions are complexity, system of systems, decentralized solutions, and smaller and local solutions. This requires larger knowledge, the local knowledge. But on the other hand, we have water companies that are growing larger and larger, where the decision is made far and far away from those local problems. So how do you see this contradiction? Thank you.
I think, you know, for me, and I don't want to sound cynical, right, but change happens either because of fear or greed, right? And the problem that we currently have is that we have well-functioning but unsustainable systems. We believe that our systems are going to last forever, so we have this complacency, right? And only now people are starting to observe some of the challenges with things like climate change and population dynamics. And the asset issue is really like a ticking time bomb, right? How they manage, particularly the underground infrastructure. And so what I think, two things can happen, right? One is that there's a crash, there's an inevitability about things sort of going out of sync. So we move from well-functioning, unsustainable systems to poor-functioning, unsustainable systems. And then we have to react, right? But the other thing that I see happening is that in the emerging economies, right, they are really learning a lot of lessons from the mistakes that we made in the West in terms of the way we built our infrastructure and the way we manage our infrastructure. And I think that the imperative for change will come because we start to see new systems emerging. So the disruption, because you see, in most of these countries where we have these large utilities, we have a lot of legacy infrastructure. And we're just managing to maintain it, right? And they're highly centralized systems. And we don't have the intellectual capacity to understand how we transition from where we are to a new way of doing things. It's very hard to do. You know, one of the things I tell people is that most of the decision makers now, they need to move from left brain to right brain thinking, because on the one hand, they really do want to move to more circular economy approach, right? They realize that that's the way forward. But they also have problems because there's a lot of uncertainty associated with the future. So on the one hand, they want to move, but then they don't really know how the future looks. But then their reality is that they have to invest in things today. And those things will last for 20 to 30 years. Today, a decision maker has to put in a new pipe or has to build a new unit, right? And because they can't manage that complexity, they replace old with new and they reinforce the old paradigm. And so I think it's inevitable that a lot of the Western utilities are going to sort of reinforce the old paradigm. But the emerging economies, who are starting a little bit from scratch, right? Because most of the urbanization is taking place where villages are becoming towns that are becoming cities. They are starting to think about decentralization. They're starting to think about, you know, doing some of these clever things. And I think that then creates the imperative that shifts, that creates a new normal. That shifts the way in which utilities work. You know, it's very hard, right? You know, water utilities are like tankers, right? You have to sort of, you know, start moving them 2 or 3 miles out of port to sort of get them in the right direction. And it takes a lot of inertia, right? And so that's the reality. And I think that the emerging economies, and you're seeing some thinking taking place in India and parts of Africa where they're looking at decentralization, that will create a new normal that will shift the way in which utilities are thinking. That's my own sort of view. I'm very optimistic, actually, and particularly because in terms of wastewater, you see a lot's going on now in that space. Any more questions? Okay, so I'm going to close. Thank you very much. Thank you.